Hello again, and thank you for returning and joining us to part two of the Coptic Canadian History Project titled Scholars Discussing Coptic Studies. This audio blog is a series aimed to bring together junior and established scholars from across North America and to offer insight on the research being conducted in Coptic populations around the world. My name is Essam Iskander, returning with you. I'm a translator and interpreter with the Diocese of New York and New England, and where I joined again today by Candace Lukasik, PhD candidate in Anthropology at UC Berkeley, and Michael Akladios, PhD candidate of History at York University in Toronto. We also, once again, would like to acknowledge and thank the venue hosting us, the St. Mary Christian Coptic Orthodox Center of Staten Island, the headquarters of the Coptic Orthodox Diocese of New York and New England, under His Grace Bishop David, for hosting this second installment of our episode with us. And of course, for the second installment, we also stress that the views, opinions expressed in this recording do not reflect on the center, its staff, the diocese bishop, or diocese. So with that out of the way, welcome guys again.
Thank
So
you.
we just finished, we were discussing last time in part one, we're discussing the impact of that time, that decade, that mysterious decade of the 50s. That seemed to just be the defining point, the BC and the AD of the Coptic immigration experience. So that, of course, leads us in part two to the very natural and not so easy question of what is Coptic identity? Such simple words, such long answers that could go in. So, who is brave enough to approach this, let's just say it's as hot as the Middle East summer topic? Who wants to start? Candace, go ahead.
I would say that, from conversations Michael and I have had previously, that we might have different perspectives. Mine is only, my perspective has to do with really thinking about Coptic identity from a methodological perspective, through the Coptic Orthodox religious tradition, in the sense that a lot of the conversations that I've had with my interlocutors and those that I've worked with in the field have been ones that are very religious and are engaged in particular questions around the nature of the Coptic Orthodox tradition, particularly.
Were they clergy or lay people?
Clergy and lay people alike. But the lay people also involved in like theological discussions of sorts, both in the United States and Canada. And so I think about Coptic identity through that lens, which happens to be a religious one, thinking about the Orthodox tradition, Copts' place in it, Coptic history of kind of finding their way within Orthodoxy or not finding their way within Orthodoxy, depending on who you're speaking with. And so that's where I kind of place myself in thinking about Coptic identity. Again, that's not to say that in previous research I've focused on kind of the political life of Copts, particularly in Egypt. But if we're thinking about Coptic identity for those of us that work in diaspora populations, it's definitely going to be different from if we are solely focusing on Copts, let's say in Egypt, which have a variety of different ways of identifying themselves because they're Egyptian citizens. Whereas in the United States or Canada, where there isn't kind of a national identity of sorts, despite the fact that maybe there are some groups that wish there was a national identity.
We've known those. Yes.
There's a lot more uncertainty as to what being Coptic means. So that's kind of where I place myself in that question, and I'm sure that Michael has different perspective.
Michael, this could be answering the question on behalf of myself as well. How does a Christian Coptic male researcher identify what being Coptic identity entails?
Okay, so as Candace said, her and I have had conversations about this before, and where I do agree with her completely that it is a religious identity, that it is attached to a religious culture of what it means to be a Coptic Christian, to fast 280 days out of a year, to
280.
Okay.
I have a lot of catching up to do. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry. Go on. Sorry, guys. Sorry.
Threw me off completely. Okay, so to be a member of a congregation and to know your priest very well, visit your home, to call everyone tant and uncle, aunt and uncle.
Yes. They started calling me uncle, by the way.
Oh, really? That's you're there.
You got old, or there's just too many kids in my congregation. But anyway, yes, go on.
I believe that there is another component to that, and that is the sense of ethnic exceptionalism, the idea of a vaunted Egyptian cultural heritage as Egyptian, the mother of civilization, the pharaonic heritage, the deep history of Egypt and its wonders of the world, and so on. So, in that sense, what it means to be Coptic is combined with what it means to be Egyptian.
So it's an accumulative identity.
Yes.
It kind of has all these layers, like a pyramid, maybe. No, okay.
In the Canadian context, that comes into play as a way to celebrate your heritage in a multicultural country.
Of course.
I am proud to be descended from pharaonic heritage and a Coptic heritage.
Okay.
Therefore, I am Copto-Pharaonic, which is language that I have seen personally in advertisements for church festivals that are meant to invite the broader community, whatever ethnic persuasion they happen to be, to come and consume.
Food? Consume
culture.
Oh, culture. Okay. Because if you see in our Coptic festivals, it's all about the food. Anyway, go and Christian. There is a lot of food, and there's some Christianity, and you could just choose whatever you want. I'm sorry, go on.
Food is culture.
Food indeed is culture. 280 days, man, out of the year. Yeah, go on. Sorry, go on.
So that's how I see Coptic identity, as part an ethnic identity and part a religious identity, and that is how it plays a role in people's lives in the diaspora. In the Egyptian context,
yes,
it has come to be that. It has come to be, I am Coptic, therefore I am Copto-Pharaonic. Therefore, I am not only religiously different, but culturally different, and therefore ethnically different than a Muslim Egyptian. It has created intense divides where that didn't exist, or existed to a much lesser scale in the 30s and 40s.
Okay, so when I hear...
Could I actually ask you
I'm sorry, go ahead,
Michael?
Candace. Yes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Since I think that, just to draw out, I guess, our differences both as, as an American scholar for myself and as a Canadian scholar for Michael, that being in both the Canadian and the U.S. context, obviously they operate off of different units of analysis. So obviously culture is a very important unit of analysis in the Canadian context for the larger political environment. Whereas I would argue that let's say race and religion in the United States are more important units of analysis in terms of thinking about rights and how to get your rights as a citizen, which could be seen in kind of Coptic campaigns to label themselves as a race on censuses, however it is, censuses,
Census.
Okay.
census.
Yes.
For the past two times, I believe, particularly in Los Angeles, but I've also heard in the New York, New Jersey area as well. Yeah. So my question, I guess, to Michael would be, that was a point of clarification. My question has more to do with those that are in the diaspora, or let's just say the United States and Canada, because diaspora is a broad term. What do you say to those who don't identify themselves as Egyptian, but only as Coptic? And this is coming from fieldwork experience from some in the second generation, those that been born here that want to distance themselves from Egypt as kind of a symbol of Islam. That's from their words, and Islamic culture and the negative things that they attach onto that. So what would that change, I guess, kind of your perspective in terms of the ethnic quality to Coptic identity?
Well, I've seen that as well. I've seen it in a bit of a different form, where or maybe not. Maybe you can clarify. Second generation, growing up in a Coptic church, and celebrating their Pharaonic heritage, celebrating an Egyptian identity that is almost ahistorical, that is divorced from the present realities.
This perplexes me a lot. I mean, how does a monotheistic identity as Coptic somehow find harmony side by side with a pharaonic identity which was by nature pagan? I mean, I don't see any inscriptions on the wall of pharaohs eating kofta. So I'm just trying to figure it out.
Ask anyone and they will tell you Egyptians were the first monotheists.
In terms of history, let's be clear as to kind of what the origins of these ideas of a Copto-Pharaonic heritage is, or was, or has developed into, started in the colonial period, particularly in the 19th century and the early 20th century. So Gaston Maspero, as an example, the Maspero State Television building, Gaston Maspero was a huge Coptologist who connected kind of
the
name of the scientist who the TV building was named after.
Yeah.
Wasn't it Edward Poole Lane? Was that him as well?
I mean, there's many others that were part of the colonial administration that tried to separate out Copts from their Muslim counterparts, some of which I've seen kind of very old books from like the early 19th century where they used to measure Coptic skulls and compare them with like Muslim Egyptian skulls. And say that, Copts have a different facial structure. And you see that, I'm sure, some Copts in the United States and Canada even say that, definitely Copts in Egypt would say certain things like that.
So do I have to get my skull measured?
And you also have the recent DNA testing that was taking place about if Egyptians are Arabs.
Right. And where Copts were sharing that and saying, oh, look,
Exactly.
we're right.
We were right all along. And interestingly, something that you pointed out that I think needs to also be mentioned is Edward Poole Lane, his study of Egypt's Copts, where he has a few lines where he talks about how the Coptic Church was the church that introduced monasticism to Ireland, and thereafter that monastic tradition spread throughout of Europe. That has become sort of the way to say we belong here because we gave you monasticism. Right. Similar in a way to Italians claiming Christopher Columbus as their claim to belonging to North America. Right?
Well, in New York, Italians claim belonging to America by a little dish they call pizza. So I'm not just saying this for humor, but I'm trying to understand how to relate the pharaonic linkage in simpler means of culture like food or like everyday life. I mean...
Well, you haven't seen those festivals where they have the cutouts of the pharaohs and you go take a picture?
It's just the cutouts and then you go eat bechamel afterwards. So to me, it's like the pharaonic...
An influence from the French.
Linkage, yes. With the pharaonic linkage never really made it past through. I was talking to a chef once and he was saying that there are some inscriptions on temple walls that actually point out certain recipes that the kings ate, but I'm yet to try a dish. Anyway, so we just don't go to tangent. So let me talk about another unit of analysis that, as Candace was pointing out, is this thing we call, have you heard of it, politics? How does politics, we ended the last episode and Candace was explaining to us how the politics basically in Upper Egypt specifically with the population there, how it influenced a lot of the people's lives. So the question I would like to ask in chronological order is, so the homeland politics of Egypt where the people left in the 50s, Now, how are they coming to Canada and to America, and how are they interacting, or how are they evolving, for lack of a better word, since they left? Who wants to take this one first? Michael.
Okay, so I think when it comes to politics, it comes back, for me anyways, to this idea of Coptic identity.
Yes.
Coptic identity as, I guess, a concept, as a way of entering into a discussion of what it means to be Coptic, became more and more politicized after 1952. And that came as a result of this focus on, Arab socialism, the unity of Arab states, Arabic language, Arabic culture, the revival of forms of music and entertainment that were distinctly Arab, therefore serving the anti-colonial purpose of rejecting European influence.
Yes. My father would love you for saying these kinds of things, the vehement Nasserist that he is.
And that was Nasserism,
yes.
right? And in that sense, being Christian was you didn't any longer have the protection of the British. And you felt ostracized. And a lot of people felt, at least in the research that I have done so far, felt, in a sense, as less than. And therefore, how do you politically form a resistance to that?
Okay.
You galvanize around your religion, which is not new in the region.
So you fall back, like one step down, basically. Yeah. Okay.
Galvanizing around a religious identity is not new in the Middle East region. It's not new in the world. And that's what I see happening over the course of the 1950s and 1960s. If you read certain periodicals like Majallat Madaris al-Ahad, which is the magazine for the Sunday school.
Who made that?
It began under...
For listeners who are not familiar.
It began under Nazir Gaid.
Who's that?
Who was later Amba Shenouda and later Pope Shenouda III.
Oh, so that was his name as layman.
Yes.
Okay. Who else was on that team?
Saad Aziz.
Did he become something after that?
Abuna Makari el-Suryani.
That's his name.
Who was
a monk.
A secretary for Pope Kyrillos.
Right.
Who preceded Pope Shenouda.
Yes.
And Abuna Makari later on becomes Bishop Samuel.
Yes.
Of Public Ecumenical and Social Services.
So this was a purely church-based publication.
Of
course, it's called Sunday School, so that's kind of a giveaway of the title, but just to understand the nature of this publication.
I would be hesitant to say a church publication, because at the time that they created it,
yes,
they were part of a reform movement, a lay reform movement, and they had high hopes of reforming the church.
Well, what was deformed that they wanted to reform? Just very briefly, without going on too much of a tangent.
They weren't happy with the clerical intransigence, for lack of a better word, the obstacles being posed to lay involvement.
So because the word reform is associated with Reformation in the European or Western mind, associated with the Protestant Reformation that goes against a very well established church like the Catholic Church. So it wasn't that drastic. That's the point I'm trying to...
No, the idea was a sort of bottom-up change of injecting a youthful vigor born of the revolts of the 1920s and 1930s, the political revolts. That generation was very much influenced by that, by a restructuring, by a way to inject youthful ideas into an otherwise, or as they saw it, more sort of closed off and intractable church.
So it seems that Coptic identity has been worked upon for quite a long time by these pioneers.
Yes,
in the turn of the century.
And they are in many ways and a lot of scholars in Coptic studies call it the Coptic Renaissance.
Wow!
Because in many ways it was the movements of these early pioneers. I wouldn't say pioneers, but these early actors.
Okay.
As laymen, as members of the Sunday school movement, as
the word luminaries,
mentors in their churches, their influence really did educate a new generation, galvanize the ideas behind what it means to be Coptic, how to take pride in your religious identity, how to be more informed in the Bible, be more informed in who you are as a Coptic Christian and who you are as a Copt in Egypt.
Okay. See, so me as a listener, I benefit from this, that we can rename our Coptic festivals into Coptic Renaissance fairs, because we have a Renaissance and therefore we are entitled to have Coptic Renaissance fairs and just make it a whole different new experience.
You need to trademark that before anyone listening.
Well, it's been claimed here first at the Coptic Canadian History Project, Coptic Renaissance fairs, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so
let's bring back like Coptic dress at the time. We can get a lot of academics and scholars involved.
Yes, make Copts Renaissance again. Yes. That's right. We started something here.
But I think I never really got to the other aspect of the question, which is political identity.
Yes.
So I make a distinction in my work on political involvement in Egypt, political involvement in Canada, and political involvement in the United States. As Candace can speak to this much better than I can, because my research on the United States has only been for the past couple of months, and I'm still trying to catch up.
Yes.
In the United States context, it's particularly more, Copts tend to be particularly more political and more active, and more
outspoken.
Vocal. Yes, absolutely.
I hear them all the time.
And in the Egyptian context, it's a bit different. The idea of citizenship becomes problematic. The idea of equal participation is almost non-existent.
Of course.
And the ability to speak out is a problem. Okay. And this is one that I really latch onto because we can compare it to, for instance, Latin America.
Okay.
Brazil, since its own anti-colonial period, latched onto the language of a raceless society. And that language of a raceless society allowed the government in power, quite tyrannical government in power, to silence any protests by minority groups and say they're dissenters, this is a raceless society, everyone is equal. In the Egyptian context, and this is not to say that it's comparable, these are different contexts, but I'm simply showing some similarities. In the Egyptian context, we are all Egyptians.
Yes.
What does that do? It negates the ability to speak out, because to say, this particular group, and it could be any minority group in the country, because we tend to forget that there are still minority groups in Egypt, other than the Copts.
Yes, of course.
To speak out and say that there is injustice towards this group, or that they are not equally participating in this so-called democracy,
quote unquote, yes,
then is to be unpatriotic, is to deny that we are all Egyptian, therefore you are unpatriotic and you are infected by Western ideas, and you can't speak out.
And you have to get that checked, because you're not conforming now anymore.
And then in the Canadian context, and this is the part where it's a bit dicey, is multiculturalism plays a big role.
Yes.
And that's not to say that, all Canadians believe in multiculturalism and therefore it denies, political, or it lessens their political involvement. Rather, the Coptic clergy and lay leadership,
yes,
in the late 1970s, early 1980s, latched onto the idea of multiculturalism.
Okay.
And you see it a lot in some of the early publications like Coptology, which began in 81.
Yes.
This idea of multiculturalism became, the thing that identified, Coptic uniqueness in Canada. And so it becomes something that the at least the more the lay leadership and the clergy latch onto to define what it means to be Coptic.
It's kind of the torch that everyone gets
in Canada. Yes, and multiculturalism as a concept, as a mandate, tends to depoliticize. because it encourages the celebration of culture
And diversity.
And downplays the political.
Yes.
In order to be a good, upstanding member of Canadian society, you display your food, you display your dress, you display your culture, but you do not become vocal and political and discriminate against other groups or speak out against other groups, because then you are denying them their ability to celebrate their culture.
So, Candace, how has the political year that we had here, with all the unfolding events of all the candidates and culminating to the magnificent victory of Donald J. Trump with a delegate count that we've never seen in U.S. presidential history before, how has that influenced the development or the political growth, if you will, of the Coptic diaspora population?
So I am going to put my anthropological lens on to
Yes, please.
Say a couple of things, or like point to a couple of differences, I guess, in opinion that I focus on that Michael may see differently as a historian or in terms of his background. So I would say, though, that first and foremost, in kind of talking about the changes that occurred after the 1952 revolution in Egypt, because I'm an anthropologist of religion, I would say, and because of kind of the disciplinary background through my advisors, I would have a much different approach to thinking about religious identity, or the galvanizing around religious identity in the Middle East, and particularly that is its nature. So I would say that it's not necessarily so, and I would point to thinking through the concept of citizenship, which appears in the Egyptian constitution pre-1952, etc. That particular concept, and I would say that in introducing that concept of we are citizens of this nation state, not only in Egypt, this is not simply an issue in Egypt, but also in any other nation state form, that you're going to have a majority and a minority, or minorities, or have a country of minorities, which is the case, the supposed case of Lebanon. But what happens in the Egyptian context is that you are going to have a national identity that is going to win out, right? Because it's the nation state, right? So it's going to have, what identity is it going to have? Obviously, Nasser puts forward the idea of Arab nationalism amongst other people in the region prior to that, but he is remembered in history as its superstar in making it a global kind of turn of phrase, or a global understanding of what is actually happening in the region as movements for Arab nationalism. And so with that particular identity, it also subverts the very minority identities that we're talking about in regards to being Coptic and what that means in relationship to being Arab, or maybe it has no relationship to it for some people. For many Copts, even at that time, obviously there's a lot of Coptic Nasserists who look to Arab nationalism as kind of, not only in Egypt but also in Syria and elsewhere, as the hope to kind of bring Muslims and Christians together outside of religious identity. So I want to say that the reason that citizenship and demanding citizenship rights leads to particular binds is that you're asking for rights from a majority population that has the majority cultural identity, whether it's numerical or otherwise, right? The majority identity. You're asking for your rights from them, which means in one way or another, you're going to have to assimilate some of those cultural aspects, cultural, ethnic, linguistic aspects,
Yes.
that's like to the majority identity. So whether it's linguistically not speaking Coptic, but obviously that's not a factor in terms of our populations. Some may argue otherwise. Or whether it has to do with kind of the ways in which you present yourself as a religious citizen. in Egypt. That's the Egyptian context. So I want to say that I just personally have a different perspective when it comes to the Egyptian context and thinking about kind of what happens in 1952 around the creation of the modern Egyptian nation state. But getting to the more interesting of my comments around Coptic politics in the United States in particular, is that, well, one, we have to think about the connections between Egypt and the United States in general.
Yes.
And with the Coptic Christian population being having the highest number of, or being the majority of Egyptians in the United States, they have, one, a lot of influence in regards to kind of getting their demands as Middle Eastern Christians, because there's a lot of interest around Middle Eastern Christianity today and its survival.
Yes.
And I can say from experience, whether it's different lobbying groups, one of which is probably the most well-known is Coptic Solidarity, where Copts are the most influential Middle Eastern Christians. They might not, I'm not too sure, because I don't believe that there are any statistics out there to say that, let's say, Copts outnumber numerically, Maronite Christians in the United States or other Middle Eastern Christian populations. I'm sure that if you did some digging, you can find out, but may not be able to.
So would you say that the Coptic American population has statistically reached a level where we can say that the Coptic vote will do this or do that, or is it still too far off?
I think that's a little bit too far off, depending on the area. So,
Okay.
in New York and New Jersey, some areas of New York and New Jersey and Los Angeles and other areas have a huge number of Copts.
So they can at least swing a vote.
Right.
Maybe.
What, for example, East Brunswick, New Jersey being
Yes.
one of those areas that has a huge number of Copts
Yes.
that can influence local elections.
They seem to be endless out there, the Copts in Brunswick. I'm sorry, go on.
But I'm talking about the more general narrative around the connection between Copts and U.S. empire, and particularly because the Middle East is central to U.S. foreign policy and interests.
Of course.
And beyond that foreign policy concern, there's also the influence of evangelicals and other Protestants in thinking about Coptic persecution and Coptic, violence against Copts in Egypt in terms of biblical relevance, but also political relevance for that biblical narrative.
So they employed the Coptic story to enhance their narrative on their side of the
if you're going to look at
political spectrum.
Looking at it from, taking their religiosity seriously,
Yes.
they do see the persecution of Copts and the persecution of Middle Eastern Christians as a part of the end times. I'm not saying all Protestants, I'm saying a very particular
Denomination.
Will find how these particular events fit into their narrative, and that's why they will support Copts and Coptic lobbying against certain policies that happen in Egypt. And this goes back to thinking about what Copts in Egypt are thinking about in terms of their positionality in all of this, in terms of their connection to the government, which I would say that while there is criticism of the current president, there is also a lot of support for him still.
Yes.
And we need to take that seriously. And we also,
which president are we referring to? The
President
Egyptian.
Sisi.
The Egyptian president. Okay.
And we also need to take seriously the fact that there is a lot of Copts in the United States in particular that support the current president, President Trump.
Okay.
And so it's important to think about the reasons why behind that, and we can have a whole podcast on that, or an audio blog on that. But we have to take that support seriously, even if we as scholars find it abhorrent in one way or another, or find it to be very, very wrong. We have to take it seriously because this is how people feel.
Okay. All right.
If
Go
I
ahead,
can
Mike.
just present a caveat. So my research goes up to 1985. So I do not deal with politics as much as Candace, because a lot of the political developments, or a lot of the political involvement of Copts begins to take shape in the mid-70s and really flowers in 81 after the Pope Shenouda was put under house arrest in monastery of Saint Bishoy in Wadi Natrun in 1981. So that's where things differ in terms of the political situation, and the involvement of Copts in politics today differs slightly from the period that I deal with. Another thing is the Canadian situation, and this is something that Candace's discussion reminded me, differs in terms of the religious aspect of public conversation. Canada became very secularized after the 1960s.
I see.
And that reflects the political landscape as well as the religious landscape. And what I see in my research throughout the mid to late 60s and then going into the 70s and early 80s is the Coptic clergy, and under the lead of Bishop Samuel, who you can't really discuss Coptic immigration to North America without bringing him up, because he sort of sent the first clergy, he established the first, or helped to establish the first churches, and was always in touch with the community throughout the 1960s and 1970s, early 1970s. So under the initial clergy in Canada, that would be Abuna Moros Moros and Abuna Rafael for Montreal.
The founding fathers.
And under Bishop Samuel, there was greater involvement with the World Council of Churches, the Canadian Council of Churches, local United Church Charities, than there was with the political establishment. Okay. And where you do see communication, it was predominantly with the conservative government rather than the liberals, and it was usually on cases of attacks or incidents against Copts under Sadat in Egypt, and asking the Canadian government to condemn those attacks. So having a public display of solidarity with Christians in Egypt. But I don't think anything to the level that we see in the United States, simply because, as Candace put it very well, the U.S. plays a very major role in the Middle East and has distinct interest in the region.
Okay, so, I mean, there are several things here that emerge from this extended conversation we're having, is that we're dealing with people of the Middle East who are very religiously involved and very politically involved. So the question that just seems to come up here naturally is, how, as academics and scholars in the field, do you approach the component of emotion when you're dealing with speaking and listening to all of these people talk about all of these experiences, and how does that factor of emotion in listening to what they have to say affect or not affect your subjectivity as academics, that you, after all, are just looking from the outside into this population? Candace, why don't you?
I think it's always a balance that you have to think about, in that, one, there's nothing really, in my perspective and the way that I approach my work, is that there's nothing that is objective, in the sense that my approach to my field work is very much conditioned by who I am and how I interact with the people that have so graciously invited me into their lives.
Yes.
And so I would say that emotion is a very important schematic. Affect, as we would kind of discuss it,
of course,
is a very important schematic that affects my research, in that, one, there, as I mentioned in my previous comment, one, there are many things that, let's say, our interlocutors do that we might not necessarily personally agree with, political beliefs, etc., religious ones. But we take them seriously because that's what you do as a researcher. However, as an anthropologist, a person that, is supposed to, spend an extended period of time in, one or more locations, and to get to know those people that they're working with so well as friends and confidants, and, some people that become part of your family, there is a difficulty in navigating those relationships that many other anthropologists have spoken about too in their approach to their field site. And I would say, though, that I myself, as somebody who converted to the Coptic Orthodox Church in 2012, can say that one, in that conversion, for personal reasons, in that conversion, many things were open to me in terms of people that I spoke with, or interlocutors introducing me to members of the clerical hierarchy and saying she is
a fellow Copt.
Right, a fellow Copt.
Oh, okay.
Which definitely made me uneasy many times. Okay. Given the fact that it's viewed as kind of, particularly in the Egyptian context, as, okay, this white woman
yes.
converted to our faith, and
yes.
It solidifies its truthfulness. And
yes.
for me, I personally came to the faith through the search for religious truth.
Yes.
But I don't want that to be a reflection of, one, my abilities as an academic,
yes.
Or affect my interaction with my professional interactions with clergy, which it does in many cases. And so I think that that's something that I've had to deal with since I've converted, and I think that's something that I'll have to deal with in the future for sure, and I'll have to write about in my dissertation and hopefully eventually my book. But I think that really taking your positionality into account in your work is very important. Yes. Because the way that you gain access, who you talk to, how you talk to them, what your conversation is like,
yes.
The way that you look at the stories that you are being told, or the way that you look at the documents that you're seeing, have an effect on the story that you're going to tell. And so that's what has been probably the biggest challenge of all of the work that I've done in Egypt and now in the United States.
Oh, wow. Well, Michael, I suppose you didn't have to convert to Coptic Christianity for your research, right? You were already born into it, so you kind of had, let's just call it a head start. But still, the question is, how does that affect your sense of objectiveness? And, of course, you're born and raised in Canada, I think, right? You grew up in Canada.
Immigrated when I was 8.
You immigrated in Canada, right? So it was a long time ago. So in a sense, when you still go back to Egypt, again, the subject of the emotions of the people and how they present their things sometimes may not fully identify with how you view yourself. So how do you reconcile those?
Well, I definitely recognize my biases.
Good.
For instance, going into like this idea of we talked last time about Asad Iswad.
Yes.
Black Honey.
That great movie. Yes.
Yes. Even me saying that I see myself in that character is to locate myself on a similar plane as the people that I interview.
I see.
Who look back on their time in Egypt, living under King Farouk or living under Nasser, before 1967, the defeat of 1967.
Yes, the occupation of Sinai, yes.
As a wonderful time, as like the golden years in a way. Mm-hmm. And then discussing, their nostalgia and their disillusionment and so on, which are things that I feel when I go back to Egypt to do my field work. Where my experience based on my discipline differs from Candace is that I do not have as close a relationship with the people that I interview. I see
although you're ethnically Egyptian, but
yes,
you still don't. Okay.
But in terms of a personal, actually, relationship with that person, I don't have that because I rely mostly on documents and for my work, and I interview people.
I see.
Once or twice.
So the interviewing process creates this formality that
yes.
you're being interviewed, so they know.
But that does create its own problems because, of course, I am bringing in a set of questions, and I am bringing in what my dissertation will be. Right. So people construct their answers based on that expectation of how they should be responding to me, what I'll be looking for from their stories, and ultimately what ends up happening is, in fact, a lot of the things that they share with me that are to them tangents, or things that they will conclude by saying, oh, I don't know if this is really important to you. That's usually when I say, oh, please go on. I want to hear more. Because it's the things that people don't consider to be important that end up becoming the most important aspect of what they talk about. And therefore, that's what I latch onto and what I want to hear about. But sometimes they are very... they see the questions that sometimes they ask for in advance, or they see the description of what it is my research is about.
Yes.
And they formulate their questions in that regard. In terms of my own emotions, I recognize I'm Coptic. I come from a very religious family. And I grew up with stories of my grandfather, who was a member of the lay council, who was... responsible for building several churches and monasteries in Egypt.
Oh,
so in that sense, I grew up, surrounded by this, and this sense of Coptic exceptionalism. Right. So I check myself regularly, and I have to be careful. And like Candace put it, we have to be careful of what lens we look at the documents and what lens we look back and listen to our interviews in.
Yes.
Because who we are affects how we write and how we present our arguments.
Okay, so we're still discussing this whole component of emotion when it comes to your respective study fields, and when it comes to the Coptic population, just from a perspective of someone who watches current events, one cannot help but hearing, especially this past year, about all the violence that occurred, bombings, shootings, all sorts of violence that the Coptic Egyptian population has been a target of. So I can't help but ask, because this is maybe the only time that a regular non-academic person would hear the word Coptic and would associate it with this terrible act that they read in the media or watch. So how do you as academics and scholars have an obligation to become politically involved or engaged, or how do you just process this kind of terrible events? Candace?
I would say that every time in the past, like, let's say year, every time an incident happens, that's when people that are not in my field, family members, friends, etc., who know that I myself am Coptic, but also and have friends there, etc. But I'm also studying Copts here and there. That's when they pay attention, and that's how they read Copts is through that violence. So what I would say is that, I do think that we have an obligation to understand the ways to talk about that violence and to explain it thoroughly in our work, taking into effect the tragedy that it is for the families that are affected by that violence, the family, the friends, the general community that are affected by that violence. But also to be careful, and I said this previously, to be careful academically how we present that violence, because it can be subsumed into a narrative that is already set in place by members of, let's say, aspects of the Christian right in the United States. that plays into narratives of Islamic terror, Islamic violence, as being inherent to the Muslim communities.
So you don't want your research to play into their
political
agenda.
It's a balance. It's a balance that you have to have, where you take that persecution, that violence seriously, but you don't want to be subsumed into many publications and websites, etc., that are now focusing mainly on Iraqi Christians and the decimation of the Christian population in northern Iraq.
Yes.
And obviously in Syria as well.
Yeah.
We're focusing on that violence and saying, look at, this is what Muslims do.
Mm-hmm.
So let's be careful not to let them into our country, because we don't want that to happen to us. For these poor Christians, we need to be careful. This is the cradle of Christianity. This is where Jesus, lived and preached, etc. So we have to be careful not to have our work be subsumed into those narratives, at least for me, but also be attentive to the struggles that Copts face on a daily basis in Egypt, and also the tragedy that comes with many of these incidents.
Yes. Okay, so go ahead, Mike.
I would say that I completely agree with you, as I did the last time this topic came up, that we need to be careful. But I would also say that we do need, as academics, to be politically engaged, involved, and to be community engaged. And what I mean by that is the falling towards the right, falling towards conservative rhetoric of all Muslims are evil, Christians are being persecuted, they need protection, they need support, is something that is very prominent in the community that we study. And I think, coming from the perspective of a historian, providing context to people is important to me.
Yes.
About what things were like and what things are like today, and how people live their lives in Egypt, as someone who goes there regularly and speaks with friends and family of my age who never go back and assume a certain way of looking at Egypt.
A perspective or
perspective
right.
that almost is ahistorical, that negates time, that things have always been bad. Okay. And I think the most poignant example of that for me is I was speaking to children in Egypt, a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old.
Okay.
And they were telling me about school, and so I asked, what are your friends like? What are their names?
Yes.
And they listed off a few names, and I'm like, you don't have Muslim friends? Like, no, we don't have Muslim friends. Did you know there's a war going on between Christians and Muslims?
Oh, okay. I had a lot of Muslim friends growing up.
So did I.
That was a long time ago. But
and for me, that was early 90s. So, like, to hear that come out of a child is very
eye-opening
and very scary.
Would you say that in going back to Egypt and visiting your family members, etc., there that the immigrant populations that go back, like from Canada and the United States, Copts that go back to Egypt, do you think that they're influencing these narratives in a way that is producing this divide more and more? Like, do you think that the narratives that are happening here are affecting there?
Very interesting.
That's a very interesting question, and it's something I never asked, so I can't really speak to. But what I did notice is this idea of a war also came up with a conversation with a friend of a friend over dinner, who was telling me about apartment buildings that had Muslim and Coptic families. Over time,
like Coptic, any Egyptian building.
Yeah, like any Egyptian building.
Right.
Over time, the Coptic families are moving out because of just daily discrimination.
And where do
going
they go?
Down to more Coptic apartment buildings.
So they have buildings now where there's majority or entirely inhabited by
Coptic families, because of daily discrimination going up and down the stairs, of going to church on a Sunday morning and coming back, like that almost regular feature of sectarian strife in the country, on an everyday level, has started to create dividing lines, very sharp dividing lines. And it was that simple conversation with two children that sort of
revealed this to you.
Not revealed it, but just made me so hyper aware of how bad things are going.
I see.
And informing, and then you come back here and you speak to friends or acquaintances or so on, and they have no Muslim friends, or if they do, they're work colleagues, and they are influenced by a generation that has witnessed some of the most violent attacks on Copts in Egypt. And therefore, these dividing lines, I think maybe to help answer some of what Candace was pointing at, although not in the Egyptian context, some of these dividing lines are being passed on to youth in North America that have never experienced it in Egypt.
So they just export this notion, and we just consume it.
Exactly.
We don't even
so even
ask where it came from or how it came
about. The fear and anxiety and distrust are entering, a generation that's never been to Egypt or maybe visited, to go to Sharm el-Sheikh, which is a resort area, right. To go for like 1 or 2 weeks and go to the swimming, right? So these are things that I think, as an academic, as someone who is informed of the history of the current developments of, you can engage and speak to and educate and inform people that if we keep down this road, bad things will happen. Okay. And we're already seeing this effect on our children and the next generation. We should not keep perpetuating it.
Okay, so as we now discussed your approach personally towards different events and how objective you should be, I guess the next question would be, Candace was mentioning something as to the effect of not feeding into the political narratives of specific political groups, both here and in Egypt. So the question would be, how do these political relations between the church and the state, that is, and also internal church politics, how do they affect your actual fieldwork collection of data and access to research material, whether in Egypt or abroad? Who would like to take this? Candace.
My answer will be pretty brief in that I would say that, and this is something that I definitely need to write about in my dissertation, that this is tied to how we approach our research effectively or emotionally.
Yes.
And what our positionality is in all of it, who we are. So obviously for myself, I am almost always introduced to bishops that I don't know, or priests or other people as the Coptic convert from the United States.
Okay.
And so that is the way that I am looked at, and I try to clarify, that I'm an anthropologist, I'm an academic,
yes.
I'm doing this as serious research, etc.
Yes.
But that still colors the way that priests and bishops and others, members of the clergy, but also lay people as well, speak with me. And then they ask for my conversion story, almost always, which puts me in a very uncomfortable position.
Because you always have to give part of your personal story.
Right. Not only that, but it makes the kind of the academic work that I do, it makes it a little bit, in my view, a little less serious, in that we're having a conversation here, and I understand that you want to hear my personal story, but
that's not necessarily the main topic
of
discussion.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Obviously, those interlocutors that I spend, extensive periods of time with are very much aware of and integral to my story of conversion and how that affects kind of the way that I do research in Egypt,
yes.
and also in the United States.
Yes.
But I would say that that particular dynamic as a convert has certainly affected the way that I collect data, and has certainly affected my access to research materials in Egypt. I will tell you a very quick story of this summer. I was with a bishop who wanted to show me a new museum that he was trying to develop, or like a semi-museum, a collection of material that he had. And so he left the people that I had gone with. He said, "Oh, I want to take you somewhere." And he left the people that I had gone to the monastery with, and said, "Okay, we're going to hop in my pickup, and we're going to go to
bishops have pickups."
These,
that's okay. That's interesting.
Artifacts.
Okay, yes.
And part of me in that moment wondered if I was of Egyptian descent, let's say, or
if you've
a
been
Coptic
given,
academic,
you've been
would
given
I
that exceptional
still have had
treatment.
the access? And I definitely would say no.
Yes.
So that is something that I have to keep in mind in thinking about who I am and what my positionality is in my research and in my relationship to my interlocutors.
So let's relay this to Mike. Since you're not a convert and you also grew up in a very distinct, historically prominent Coptic family with many connections and many contributions to the Coptic church in Egypt, how has that tinged your research as far as collecting data?
Okay, so for me, getting access to certain bishops and certain priests hasn't been that difficult, because thankfully my family connections do get me in the door.
You won the Coptic lottery as far as family names, so yes, of course.
However, as a Copt and a male who is in his late 20s, unmarried,
you didn't get to see the museum that Candace saw. See, that's
I didn't get to see that museum.
Not just that, but okay, right.
But also, it automatically puts you in a position of less than. No matter how distinguished you are as an academic, you are still a youth of the church.
One of the children of the church, and therefore treated in that stature.
The initial conversation that Candace shared, that she gets put in a position where she has to describe her conversion story. I get in a position where I have to describe what church I belong to, who my father of confession is, why, how do I serve the church, when do I serve the church, where do I go, and any misstep or wrong answer automatically puts you at the position of someone who needs to be educated, who needs to be lectured, who is in a position of weakness.
So ironically, you face a steeper uphill road.
No, I think we both face differences, and I would say that I have I recognize my privilege in opposition to Candace.
Yes. Or variance, really.
In a different way to Candace, that I am a guy, and I am
ethnically Coptic,
religiously Coptic, ethnically Egyptian,
yes, of course.
For instance, one thing that Candace and I talked about previously is how automatically people are shocked when they hear her speak Arabic, but for me, it's an expectation that I speak Arabic.
Yeah, it still shocks me. Her Arabic is impeccable. Yeah. I mean, I've heard it.
So in that sense, there is that power dynamic. In terms of collecting data, I rely on oral interviews, which I've been fortunate to have success with, thanks to the help of many people who have kind of led me to other interviewees and so on.
Yes.
But in terms of collecting hard data, documents, photos, video, and so on,
it's been hard.
It's been difficult because of the kind of research questions that I'm asking.
Oh yes, the tough questions.
The tough questions.
Okay, of course.
And in that sense, you need to be careful of what you want to study.
Yes.
And to know if you're going to be able to get access to that material. And the one thing I would share is that I have been told to change my research topic repeatedly. I've been told to leave this topic and go do something else. This is not something you're going to succeed in. So in that sense, you need to know your audience.
Of course, and Egyptian psychology is when you're told you cannot do something, you will not get something.
You want to do it even more.
It just helps you go completely into different directions.
Why do you think I'm going into year 4?
Yes. Well, we all wonder that. Never mind. So, for the interest of time, we would like to drive this home and ask our very distinguished guests here, what advice would you give to those youngins interested in pursuing similar research to both of you respectively? Candace.
I would say that from somebody who didn't grow up in the church and doesn't speak Arabic as a native tongue.
But you went to Bahagora more than any one of us combined.
Yes. Well, yes. I would say my advice is that it takes time.
Of course.
You need to be willing to give up a lot of your personal life to pursue these things and have the research become an aspect of your personal life for years, for many, many years. Since I've been going to Egypt since 2007 and have started to work academically on Coptic communities here and back in Egypt since 2012. And so since 2012 until today, I mean, it's been everything that I've, researched, read, looked at, thought of, etc. So, yeah, it takes time.
Okay. Michael, what does it take for the young generations? Tell us.
It takes time. Absolutely. I completely agree. And a master's is a shorter commitment. If you're interested in maybe doing a master's thesis on a particular aspect, it's a year or 2 years depending on the program.
So you're saying because it takes a lot of time, spend less time studying? Is that what it is?
It's a PhD is 5 to 6 years.
Yes.
If you're
factoring in Egyptian delay, so it'd be 5.5 to 6.5 years. Okay.
And what you're looking at is a very big time investment. Candace is absolutely right. A lot of research, and you need to make sure that material is there. So before you jump into it, which is something that I think I would have been more hesitant if I'd realized how many obstacles I would encounter. Make sure that the material is there, or you can get access to it, and make sure you're willing to put in that commitment and put your life practically on hold at times in order to get through the research and the preparation and the coursework initially, and look to those that are in it, like Candace and I and other
fellow researchers
who are already in this and ask questions. And if you decide to start on this topic, look to us for advice and for hints and for contacts and so on. We've done this and we're still working on it, and we're gathering those kinds of connections and this kind of knowledge that we can pass on.
Mentorship is key.
Absolutely. And look to the Coptic Canadian History Project, because our website has a brand new resource page, which includes a lot of secondary and primary material and where to find them. And we also have access to El Karaza, which is a Coptic publication that began in the 1960s and goes up to present day. That gives so much content that anyone can spend their whole life digesting and dissecting and writing on. So that's just one example, but there are a lot of resources that can, I think, guide people in the right direction. And my email is there too if you want to contact me. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this plug-in of all the resources available to us. And that concludes our two-part episode of the Coptic Canadian History Project, Scholar Discuss Coptic Studies. I would like to thank our audience for tuning in, and for our participants, Candace Lukasik, PhD candidate in Anthropology at UC Berkeley, and Michael Akladios, PhD candidate in History at York University in Toronto. We would once again like to thank the St. Mary Christian Center of Staten Island, the headquarters of the Diocese of New York and New England, under His Grace Bishop David, for hosting us this afternoon. My name is Essam Iskander, translator and interpreter of this diocese, and I invite you to stay tuned for future posts to the Coptic Canadian History Project. You can also follow the project on Facebook, Twitter, and visit them on www.thecchp.com. Thank you.